costume during the 13th century in Europe was very simple for both men and women, and quite uniform across the continent. Male and female clothing were relatively similar, and changed very slowly, if at all. Most clothing, especially outside the wealthier classes, remained little changed from 3 or 4 centuries earlier. The century saw great progress in the dyeing and working of wool, which was by far the most important material for outerwear. For the rich, color was very important. Blue was introduced and became very fashionable, being adopted by the kings of France as their heraldic color. Men's clothing. Men wore a tunic, coat or cot with a surcoat over a linen shirt. One of these surcoats was the cyclar, which began as a rectangular piece of cloth with a hole in it for the head. Over time the sides were sewn together to make a long, sleeveless tunic. When sleeves and sometimes a hood were added, the cyclar became a ganache or a garde-corps. A mantle was worn as a formal wrap. Men also wore hosed shoes, and headdress. The clothing of royalty was set apart by its rich fabric and luxurious furs. Hair and beard were moderate in length, and men generally wore their hair in a pageboy style, curling under at neck length. Shoes were slightly pointed, and embroidered for royalty and higher clergy. Working men's clothing. Working men wore a short coat, or tunic, with a belt. It was slit up the center of the front so that they could tuck the corners into their belt to create more freedom of movement. They wore long bras or leggings with legs of varying length, often visible as they worked with their cot tucked into their belt. Hose could be worn over this, attached to the drawstring or belt at the waist. Hats included a round cap with a slight brim, the beret, the coif, the straw hat, and the chaperon. Then still a hood that came round the neck and over the shoulders. Style gallery. 1 work clothes, 2 shirt, 3 tunics, 4 tunics and mantles, 5 kappa or chaperon, 6 tunics, 7 tunics with hanging sleeves. Men working in linen bras, tunics, and coifs, from the Maciejowski Bible, 1250. The man on the left wears green hose over his bras. Man in a coif and shirt with gussets at the hem, from the Cantigas de Santa Maria, Spain, mid-13th century. Falconers wear belted tunics and coifs, 1240s. Young Merlin wears a short tunic with a rectangular cloak or mantle and hose. King Vortigern wears a mantle draped over both shoulders over a long overgown or tunic and shoes with straps at the instep. From a manuscript of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Prophetia Merlini, 1250–70. Man in the short, hooded cape called a kappa or chaperon, 1250–70. Musicians wear 2 long tunics, one over the other. The tunic on the left is an early example of mi-party or party-colored clothing, made from 2 fabrics. Cantigas de Santa Maria, mid-13th century, Spain. Panpipe players wear tunics with hanging sleeves over long-sleeved under-tunics. Both wear coifs. Cantigas de Santa Maria, mid-13th century, Spain. Women's clothing. Overview. Dress for women was modest and restrained. A floor-length, loosely fitted gown, with long, tight sleeves and a narrow belt was uniform. Over it was worn a cyclar or sleeveless surcoat, also worn by men. More wealthy women wore more embroidery, and the mantle, held in place by a cord across the chest, might be lined with fur. Women, like men, wore hose and leather shoes. Headdresses and hairstyles. Individuality in women's costume was expressed through their hair and headdress. One distinctive feature of women's headwear was the barbette, a chin band to which a hat or various other headdress might be attached. This hat might be a woman's coif, which more nearly resembled a pillbox hat, severely plain or fluted. The hair was often confined by a net called a crespine or crespinet, visible only at the back. Later in the century, the barbette and coif were reduced to narrow strips of cloth, and the entire hairdress might be covered with the crespine. The hair fashionable bulky over the ears. Coif and barbettes were white, while the crespine might be colored or gold. The wimple and veil of the 12th century, still seen on nuns today, was still worn, mainly by older women and widows. style. Gallery 1 from the Morgan Bible, 1250. The wife of Manoah wears a veil and wimple. Note: striped hose. Sumptuary laws. The Fourth Council of the Lateran of 1215 ruled that Jews and Muslims must be distinguishable by their dress, beginning the process that transformed the conical or pointed Jewish hat from something worn as a voluntary mark of difference to an enforced one. Previously it had been worn but had been regarded by European Jews as an element of traditional garb, rather than an imposed discrimination. A law in Breslau in 1267 said that since Jews had stopped wearing the pointed hats they used to wear, this would be made compulsory. The yellow badge also dates from this century, although the hat seems to have been much more widely worn. Sumptuary laws covering prostitutes were introduced in the 13th century. In Marseille a striped cloak, in England a striped hood, and so on. Over time these tended to be reduced to distinctive bands of fabric attached to the arm, or shoulder, or tassels on the arm. These probably reflected both a growing concern for control over the increasing urban populations, and the increasing effectiveness of the Church's control over social issues across the continent. Footwear. Shoes began to develop a pointed toe at this time, however, they were much more restrained than they were in the 14th century. The usual shoe for men opened at the front, from the instep to the toe. Commoners also wore stockings with leather sewn to the sole, and wooden clogs. Woolen gaiters were also worn by commoners.